America called itself the land of freedom, but millions of its citizens lived under laws designed to keep them unequal. After the Civil War, the United States stood at a crossroads. Slavery had been abolished. The Constitution had been amended. On paper, freedom and equality were finally guaranteed to all Americans. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the nation was moving toward justice. But that moment did not last. When Reconstruction collapsed in the late 19th century, the promises made to formerly enslaved people began to disappear. One by one, the protections were stripped away. Federal troops withdrew from the South, and state governments regained control. What followed was not chaos, but a carefully constructed system. It was called Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws legalized racial segregation across the American South. They dictated where Black Americans could live, work, study, travel, and even where they could sit or stand in public. Every part of daily life was divided by race, and while the law claimed this system was separate but equal, the reality was painfully clear. Schools for Black children were overcrowded and underfunded. Neighborhoods were deliberately neglected. Hospitals, transportation, and public services were inferior or inaccessible. Equality existed only in words, not in life. Voting, the foundation of American democracy, was systematically denied. African Americans were blocked from the ballot box through literacy tests, poll taxes, and threats of violence. Many were punished simply for trying to register. And when violence occurred, when families were terrorized, when lives were lost, the legal system often looked away. By the early 20th century, African Americans were no longer enslaved, but they were not free in any meaningful sense. They lived under laws designed to limit their opportunities, silence their voices, and control their future. Yet this system was built on a contradiction, because the United States Constitution already promised something different. It promised equal protection under the law. It promised due process. It promised the right to vote and participate in democracy. These were not new demands. These were existing rights, long denied, and that is what makes the civil rights movement so important. This movement was not a rejection of American ideals. It was a demand that America live up to them. The civil rights movement was not about asking for special treatment. It was not about creating new freedoms. It was about forcing the nation to finally honor the freedoms it had already promised, but failed to deliver for generations. What followed was one of the most powerful struggles in American history. Ordinary men and women challenged unjust laws. Children faced hatred with courage. Communities stood together against a system designed to keep them silent. This was not just a fight for civil rights. It was a test of American democracy itself, and the outcome would change the nation forever. The legal spark. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. In 1954, the civil rights movement found its first major breakthrough, not in the streets, but in a courtroom. For more than half a century, racial segregation in American schools had been protected by law. That protection came from an 1896 Supreme Court decision called Plessy versus Ferguson, which declared that racial segregation was legal as long as facilities were separate but equal. In reality, they never were. Across the country, Black children attended overcrowded schools with outdated books, broken buildings, and fewer resources, while white schools received funding, support, and opportunity. This injustice was finally challenged in a case known as Brown versus Board of Education. The case was brought by Black families from several states who argued that segregated schools violated the Constitution. Their argument was simple but powerful. Separating children by race caused harm and denied them equal protection under the law. On May 17, 1954, the United States Supreme Court delivered its decision. The court ruled unanimously that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. In its opinion, the court stated that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. With those words, the legal foundation of Jim Crow education was shaken. Plessy v. Ferguson, the decision that had justified segregation for nearly 60 years, was effectively overturned. For the first time, the highest court in the land acknowledged what Black Americans had known all along. Segregation itself was a form of inequality. But the victory came with a painful reality. The ruling did not order schools to integrate immediately. Instead, the court called for desegregation to happen with all deliberate speed, a phrase that would soon be used to delay justice rather than deliver it. Across the South, many state governments resisted the decision. Some passed new state laws to block integration. Others shut down public schools entirely. Many used legal loopholes, delays, and intimidation to avoid compliance. In some communities, white families organized protests. In others, Black children faced threats simply for trying to attend school. The law had changed, but society had not. Brown vs. Board of Education proved something critical. The system could be challenged, but it also revealed a deeper truth. Court rulings alone were not enough to dismantle segregation. Real change would require courage, sacrifice, and action, not just from judges, but from ordinary people willing to confront the system themselves. And soon, that confrontation would move from the courtroom to the streets. Mass resistance and white backlash. When the South fought back, the Supreme Court had spoken. Segregation in public schools was now unconstitutional. But in much of the American South, the response was not acceptance. It was resistance. Many Southern political leaders openly rejected the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. They claimed the federal government had no right to interfere in state affairs. Behind that argument was a deeper fear, the loss of a racial system that had controlled Southern society for generations. This organized opposition became known as massive resistance. State governors, lawmakers, and school boards worked together to block integration by any means possible. Some states passed new laws to delay desegregation. Others used legal loopholes to avoid compliance. In several cases, public schools were shut down entirely rather than allow Black and white children to learn together. As resistance hardened, intimidation and violence increased. Black families who attempted to enroll their children in white schools were threatened. Homes were vandalized. Jobs were lost. Communities lived under constant fear. Nowhere was this conflict more visible than in Little Rock, Arkansas. In 1957, 9 Black students, later known as the Little Rock Nine, attempted to attend Central High School, an all-white public school. They were teenagers. They carried books, not weapons, and they were met by angry mobs. Crowds gathered outside the school, shouting insults and threats. The situation grew so dangerous that Arkansas Governor Orval Faubus ordered the state's National Guard to block the students from entering the building. For weeks, the world watched as American children were denied an education, not by law, but by force. The crisis reached the White House. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man who had commanded Allied forces during World War II, now faced a different kind of battle, one at home. Reluctantly, but decisively, Eisenhower acted. He placed the Arkansas National Guard under federal control and sent U.S. Army troops to Little Rock to protect the students. For the first time since Reconstruction, federal soldiers were used to enforce civil rights against state resistance. Under armed protection, the Little Rock Nine entered Central High School. They faced harassment and isolation every day, but they remained, and their presence sent a powerful message. The federal government was no longer willing to ignore segregation. Little Rock proved that civil rights were not just moral issues, they were constitutional ones. And when states defied the Constitution, federal power could and would be used to enforce it. The system had been challenged in court. Now it was being confronted in real life, and this confrontation was only beginning. The power of nonviolent protest. How ordinary people forced change the courts had spoken. Federal troops had been sent. But real change required more than laws and soldiers. It required people. The next phase of the civil rights movement did not begin in Washington or in courtrooms. It began in everyday places, on city buses, at lunch counters, and on college campuses. And it was built on a powerful idea: nonviolent protest. A. The Montgomery Bus Boycott, 1955-1956. In December 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, a quiet act of resistance sparked a nationwide movement. Rosa Parks, a black seamstress, boarded a city bus after a long day of work. When she was ordered to give up her seat to a white passenger, she refused. She was arrested. Her decision was not impulsive, it was deliberate, and it exposed the injustice of segregation to the entire nation. In response, Montgomery's black community took action. They stopped riding the buses. For 381 days, African Americans walked to work, shared rides, or stayed home, even though buses were the main source of public transportation. The boycott was organized and disciplined. It required sacrifice, and it demanded unity. At the center of this effort was a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr., who emerged as a leader by preaching nonviolence, dignity, and perseverance. As the boycott continued, the city suffered economically. Bus companies lost revenue, pressure mounted, and the nation paid attention. Finally, the case reached the Supreme Court. In 1956, the court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. After more than a year of collective resistance, the boycott ended in victory. The lesson was clear. Economic pressure worked. Without throwing a single punch, ordinary citizens had forced the system to change. B. Sit-ins and student activism. A few years later, the movement gained new energy and new leaders. This time, they were young. In February 1960, 4 black college students sat down at a whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. They politely ordered food and refused to leave when they were denied service. This simple act became known as the Greensboro sit-ins. The students did not shout. They did not fight back. They sat and waited. What followed was brutal. They were mocked, threatened, arrested, and beaten. Food was thrown on them. Crowds tried to provoke violence, but the students remained nonviolent. Their courage inspired others. Within weeks, sit-ins spread to cities across the South, and then across the nation. Thousands of students joined the movement, turning restaurants, libraries, and public spaces into battlegrounds for equality. The pressure worked. Businesses began to lose customers. Public image suffered. One by one, lunch counters and public spaces slowly desegregated. The sit-ins proved something essential. Young people were willing to risk everything for justice, and nonviolent resistance, when sustained and visible, could force a system to bend. The civil rights movement was no longer just a legal fight. It had become a mass movement, driven by courage, discipline, and the belief that dignity was worth defending. Martin Luther King Jr. and moral confrontation. When conscience met power. By the early 1960s, the civil rights movement had found its voice. At the center of that voice was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King believed that injustice could not be defeated with hatred or violence. Instead, he argued that moral force, when combined with courage and discipline, could expose injustice for what it truly was. His philosophy was nonviolent resistance. King drew inspiration from 2 powerful sources. From Christian teachings, he embraced the idea of loving one's enemy and standing firm without revenge. From Mahatma Gandhi, he learned that peaceful protest could weaken even the strongest systems of oppression. Nonviolence, for King, was not weakness. It was confrontation, without cruelty. And nowhere was this philosophy tested more severely than in Birmingham, Alabama. The Birmingham Campaign, 1963. In 1963, Birmingham was one of the most segregated cities in America. It was known for its violent resistance to civil rights and had a long history of racial intimidation. King and other civil rights leaders chose Birmingham on purpose. Their goal was to force a national confrontation, to make the injustice impossible to ignore. Protests began with marches, sit-ins, and boycotts. Demonstrators were arrested in large numbers, including King himself. From jail, he wrote what would later become one of the most important documents of the civil rights movement, Letter from Birmingham Jail. In it, King argued that waiting for justice only guaranteed its denial. As the campaign continued, the city's police commissioner, Bull Connor, responded with brutality. Police officers released attack dogs on peaceful protesters. Firefighters blasted demonstrators with high-pressure fire hoses. Children and teenagers were arrested and dragged into police vans. These scenes were not hidden. They were captured on film and broadcast across the nation. Families watching the evening news saw American citizens, including children, being attacked for demanding basic rights. The images were shocking. They stripped away excuses. They exposed segregation not as tradition, but as cruelty. And they changed public opinion. Birmingham forced the federal government to act. President John F. Kennedy, who had previously moved cautiously on civil rights, now addressed the nation. He called civil rights a moral issue, not just a political one. Within months, his administration proposed sweeping civil rights legislation. Birmingham proved something powerful. When nonviolent protesters faced violence without retaliation, the injustice became undeniable. The confrontation was no longer between Black Americans and the law. It was between America's ideals and America's reality. And the nation could no longer look away. The March on Washington. When a nation listened, by the summer of 1963, the civil rights movement had reached a turning point. Years of protest, sacrifice, and confrontation had exposed the injustice of segregation. Court victories had challenged the law. Nonviolent resistance had revealed the system's cruelty. But one question remained. Would the nation truly listen? On August 28, 1963, that question was answered. On that day, more than 250,000 people gathered in the nation's capital for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It was the largest protest in United States history at the time. Men and women arrived by buses, trains, and cars from every corner of the country. They came young and old, black and white, workers, students, religious leaders, and veterans. They did not come to riot. They came to be seen and heard. The march was organized around clear demands. Not just an end to segregation, but equality under the law, jobs, and economic opportunity justice in the courts. Voting rights for all citizens. At the heart of the gathering stood the Lincoln Memorial, a powerful reminder of America's unfinished promise. As the crowd waited, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped forward. What followed became one of the most famous speeches in American history. King spoke not with anger, but with moral clarity. He reminded the nation that freedom delayed was freedom denied. He described a country that had written a promise of equality, but failed to keep it. Then he shared a vision, a dream of children judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. A dream of justice rolling down like waters. A dream of an America finally living up to its ideals. The crowd listened in silence, and then in thunderous applause. The speech did not demand revenge, it demanded redemption. The impact was immediate and lasting. Images of the peaceful, unified march filled newspapers and television screens across the country. For millions of Americans, it was impossible to deny the humanity, dignity, and determination of the movement. Public opinion began to shift. Political leaders felt the pressure. The March on Washington did not end segregation by itself, but it built the national support needed to change the law. It turned civil rights from a regional issue into a national cause, and it pushed the country one step closer to fulfilling its promise of freedom. Federal laws that challenged the system. When protest became law, years of marches, boycotts, and sacrifice had done something extraordinary. They had forced the nation to confront itself. By the mid-1960s, it was no longer possible to deny the reality of segregation. Public opinion had shifted, the moral argument had been made, and now the pressure had reached the highest levels of government. The civil rights movement was about to change the law permanently. A. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1964, the United States passed one of the most significant laws in its history, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This legislation struck directly at the legal foundation of Jim Crow. It ended segregation in public places, including restaurants, hotels, theaters, and transportation. For the first time, discrimination in everyday life was no longer protected by law. the act also banned discrimination in employment, making it illegal to deny jobs or promotions based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. But perhaps most importantly, the law gave the federal government the power to enforce civil rights. Before this, states could ignore court rulings with little consequence. After 1964, the federal government could investigate, sue, and withhold funding from institutions that practiced discrimination. The system that had protected segregation for decades was now being dismantled, piece by piece. B. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. Yet one critical right was still under attack: the right to vote. Despite earlier laws, many Southern states continued to block Black Americans from voting through intimidation and manipulation. In response, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This law directly targeted the tools of voter suppression. It banned literacy tests, which had been used to disqualify Black voters unfairly. It outlawed voter intimidation and harassment, and it allowed the federal government to oversee elections in states with a history of discrimination. For the first time, the federal government could step in before rights were violated, not after. The impact was immediate. Within months, Black voter registration increased dramatically across the South. Communities that had been silenced for generations finally gained political power. Local governments began to change. New leaders were elected. Voices once excluded were now heard. Conclusion of the section. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 represented a turning point in American history. They did not erase racism. They did not guarantee equality overnight. But they broke the legal backbone of segregation. For the first time since Reconstruction, the promise of democracy began to reach those who had long been denied it. The law had finally caught up with justice, but the struggle was not over, because even after the system was challenged and changed, new conflicts were already emerging. The limits of change, not all agreed. When hope met reality by the mid-1960s, the civil rights movement had achieved victories that once seemed impossible. Segregation was illegal. Voting rights were protected by federal law. The Constitution now stood clearly on the side of equality. But for many African Americans, daily life had not changed nearly enough. Laws had been rewritten, yet poverty, discrimination, and inequality remained. This growing frustration gave rise to new voices and new ideas. Not everyone believed that nonviolence alone was enough. The rise of Malcolm X and Black Power, one of the most influential and controversial voices of this period, was Malcolm X. Unlike Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X openly criticized the philosophy of nonviolence. He argued that asking oppressed people to remain peaceful in the face of violence was unrealistic and unjust. Malcolm X believed in self-defense. He argued that African Americans had the right to protect themselves, their families, and their communities by any means necessary. Beyond self-defense, Malcolm X promoted Black pride. He encouraged African Americans to reject shame, embrace their identity, and build confidence in their own history and culture. He also emphasized economic independence, arguing that true freedom could not exist without control over jobs, businesses, and resources. For many young African Americans, especially in northern cities, Malcolm X's message felt honest, urgent, and empowering. It reflected a reality they lived every day: urban unrest and exploding frustration. While civil rights laws dismantled segregation in the South, racial inequality in northern cities remained deeply entrenched. Many Black families were trapped in overcrowded neighborhoods with poor housing, limited job opportunities, underfunded schools, aggressive policing. When hope collided with hardship, anger followed. In 1965, frustration erupted in Watts, a neighborhood in Los Angeles. After a confrontation with police, days of unrest left dozens dead and millions of dollars in damage. 2 years later, in 1967, the city of Detroit experienced one of the most destructive riots in American history. Federal troops were deployed to restore order. Television screens across the country showed burning buildings, armed soldiers, and divided communities. For many Americans, the images were alarming. For many African Americans, they were a cry of desperation. The hard truth. These moments revealed a painful reality. Legal equality did not equal economic equality. Ending segregation did not erase poverty. Protecting voting rights did not guarantee opportunity. Changing the law did not immediately change lived experience. The civil rights movement had forced the nation to honor its legal promises, but it had also exposed how deep the roots of inequality truly were. America had taken a historic step forward, yet the question remained, how far was it truly willing to go? Assassination and the movement's turning point. When a voice was silenced by 1968, the civil rights movement had changed America's laws, but not its soul. Segregation had been outlawed, voting rights were protected, yet inequality, poverty, and division remained deeply rooted. At the center of the movement stood Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., not just as a leader, but as a unifying moral voice. He spoke to the nation's conscience, urging Americans to choose justice without hatred and change without violence. On April 4th, 1968, that voice was silenced. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, where he had traveled to support striking sanitation workers demanding fair wages and dignity. The news spread quickly, and with it came grief, shock, and anger. Within hours, riots erupted in cities across the United States. Neighborhoods burned, businesses were destroyed, National Guard units and federal troops were deployed to restore order. For many African Americans, King's death felt like the loss of hope itself. A man who believed in nonviolence, who had given everything to the idea of moral change, had been killed. The nation mourned, but the movement was forever altered. With King gone, the civil rights movement lost its most unifying leader, the figure who could speak across racial, political, and regional lines. Progress did not stop, but it slowed. The movement began to fragment as different groups pursued different paths forward. Some activists shifted their focus toward economic justice, arguing that legal equality meant little without jobs, housing, and fair wages. Others emphasized identity politics, prioritizing cultural pride, representation, and community empowerment. Many organizations turned toward legal defense and policy battles, working within the court system to protect the gains that had already been made. The struggle continued, but it no longer moved with one voice or one vision. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination marked the end of an era, the era of mass, unified moral confrontation. What followed would be more complex, more divided, and often more difficult. Yet his legacy endured, because the questions he raised about justice, equality, and the meaning of freedom were no longer avoidable. And America would spend the decades ahead struggling to answer them. Victory, limits, and legacy. So, did the civil rights movement succeed? In many ways, the answer is yes. The legal system that once protected segregation was dismantled. Jim Crow laws were struck down. Public spaces, schools, and workplaces could no longer legally exclude people based on race. Voting rights were expanded and protected. Millions of African Americans who had been silenced for generations were finally able to participate in democracy. For the first time since Reconstruction, the federal government accepted responsibility for enforcing civil rights, no longer leaving equality to the mercy of individual states. These were historic achievements. They reshaped American law, they redefined citizenship, and they forced the nation to confront its own contradictions. But the story does not end there, because while the laws changed, society did not change overnight. Economic inequality remained deeply rooted. Many Black families were still trapped in poverty, with limited access to quality education and jobs. Housing segregation continued, not always through law, but through policy, discrimination, and custom. Neighborhoods remained divided, opportunities remained unequal, and systemic discrimination did not disappear. It adapted. It became harder to see, harder to prove, and harder to dismantle. the civil rights movement proved something powerful. Laws can be challenged, systems can be confronted, injustice can be exposed, but it also revealed a deeper truth. Changing society takes more than laws. It takes sustained effort, economic opportunity, political will, and moral courage, generation after generation. The movement did not finish the struggle for equality. It defined it. And as America expanded its freedoms at home, it was about to face another test, far from its own streets. A deeply unpopular war abroad, one that would divide the nation like never before. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the brand new one.